Michael Turner discovered the text messages between his wife Anjali and her former boyfriend Arjun Patel at 11:37 on the night of June 14, 2023, exactly 7 days after their elaborate wedding ceremony in Dallas had united them before 200 guests who celebrated what appeared to be a perfect cross-cultural love story between a successful American businessman and a beautiful Indian fashion designer. When Michael picked up Anjali's phone to check the time after she had fallen asleep and noticed dozens of unread messages from a contact saved simply as A that contained expressions of love, longing, and plans to meet during Arjun's upcoming business trip to Texas that revealed Anjali had been maintaining an emotional and apparently physical relationship with her ex-boyfriend throughout their engagement and even after their marriage vows that Michael had believed represented genuine commitment and exclusive devotion, rather than recognizing them as words spoken under pressure from families and circumstances, while Anjali's heart remained partially attached to the man she had loved for 4 years before immigrating to America. The rage that consumed Michael as he read through months of intimate communications between his new wife and another man triggered a violent response, conditioned by his military training and amplified by his pathological need for control, and his inability to tolerate any form of betrayal or deception that threatened his carefully constructed image of masculine success and the perfect life he believed he deserved after years of struggle building his construction business and overcoming the psychological damage from combat deployments that had left him with hair-trigger temper and tendency toward violence when confronted with situations his rigid worldview categorized as requiring immediate, decisive action to eliminate threats to his dominance and dignity. The double homicide that would shock communities in both Dallas and Mumbai occurred approximately 48 hours after Michael's discovery of Anjali's affair, when Arjun Patel arrived in Texas for a technology conference and made the fatal decision to meet Anjali secretly at a hotel near the Dallas-Fort Worth airport on the evening of June 16th, unaware that Michael had been monitoring Anjali's communications since discovering the messages and had followed her to the rendezvous where he confronted both of them in the hotel parking lot before shooting Arjun twice in the chest and once in the head with the handgun he had carried since his Marine Corps service, then turning the weapon on Anjali, who had been screaming and attempting to intervene, killing her with a single shot to her head before calmly walking to his truck and driving to the Dallas Police Department headquarters, where he surrendered to officers and confessed to the murders while showing no apparent remorse beyond, stating that he had done what needed to be done to restore his honor after being betrayed and humiliated by people who had pretended to respect him while actually conspiring to make him look foolish. The investigation that followed revealed the complexity of the relationship between Michael and Anjali, including the warning signs that had been overlooked or dismissed by friends and family who had been so charmed by Michael's confident persona and apparently generous treatment of Anjali that they failed to recognize his controlling behavior, his possessiveness, and his increasingly volatile reactions to any perceived challenge to his authority over his wife, whom he viewed more as property and status symbol than as autonomous individual deserving respect and freedom to maintain her own relationships and identity. The forensic examination of Anjali's communications revealed that she had been deeply conflicted about her marriage to Michael, feeling trapped between her family's expectations, her desire for the opportunities America represented, and her genuine love for Arjun, whom she had never stopped caring for, despite the geographical distance and the practical impossibility of building a life with him, given her family's opposition to their relationship based on caste differences and economic disparities that made Arjun unsuitable in their eyes despite his obvious devotion and his successful career in technology. The relationship between Michael Turner and Anjali Mehta had begun 18 months earlier in January 2022, when they were introduced by a mutual friend during Michael's business trip to Mumbai to explore potential construction contracts in India's rapidly developing infrastructure sector. Michael had been immediately captivated by Anjali's beauty, her artistic sensibility, and her apparent fascination with American culture and lifestyle that he interpreted as admiration for him personally, rather than recognizing it as her general desire to escape the restrictive expectations of her traditional family who had been pressuring her to marry within their community despite her resistance to arranged marriage and her secret relationship with Arjun that her parents had explicitly forbidden due to his lower caste status and his family's modest financial circumstances. The courtship that Michael orchestrated was intense and rapid, with him flying to Mumbai 3 times over 4 months, while maintaining daily video calls and sending elaborate gifts that impressed Anjali's family, who saw in Michael exactly the kind of successful, stable husband they wanted for their daughter, despite their initial concerns about his different cultural background and their worry that Anjali would be isolated so far from home if she married someone who would take her to America. Michael's charm offensive included learning basic Hindi phrases, expressing interest in Indian culture and traditions, and making generous financial gestures toward Anjali's family that demonstrated his ability to provide the comfortable lifestyle they wanted for their daughter, all while carefully concealing his controlling tendencies and his explosive temper that he had learned to mask through years of projecting confidence and authority in business contexts, where showing vulnerability or emotional instability would undermine his leadership position. The marriage proposal that Michael orchestrated during his 3rd visit to Mumbai in April 2022 was elaborate and romantic, taking place at a luxury hotel overlooking the Arabian Sea, with musicians and photographers capturing the moment when Anjali accepted his ring, despite her conflicted feelings about leaving Arjun and despite her intuitive concerns about certain aspects of Michael's personality that seemed potentially problematic, though she convinced herself that her doubts reflected her own fears rather than legitimate warnings about incompatibility or danger. The acceptance of Michael's proposal was influenced by multiple factors, including family pressure, the apparent security and opportunity his wealth represented, Anjali's desire to experience life beyond the restrictive boundaries of her traditional upbringing, and her belief that her feelings for Arjun were youthful attachment that she needed to outgrow in favor of the practical, advantageous marriage that Michael offered, despite the absence of the deep emotional and intellectual connection she had shared with Arjun throughout their 4-year relationship. The immigration process that brought Anjali to America on a fiancé visa in September 2022 marked the beginning of her gradual recognition that Michael's controlling tendencies were more severe than she had realized during their long-distance courtship, with his monitoring of her communications, his restrictions on her friendships and activities, his demands for detailed accounting of her time and whereabouts, and his jealous reactions to any interaction she had with other men, all becoming increasingly apparent once she was living in his Dallas home and dependent on him for her legal status, her financial support, and her only real connections in an unfamiliar country where she had no independent support network or resources that might have enabled her to escape if she recognized the relationship as unhealthy or dangerous. The secret continuation of Anjali's relationship with Arjun throughout her engagement and after her arrival in America represented her desperate attempt to maintain connection with the person who truly understood her and with whom she felt authentic emotional intimacy, even though she recognized that continuing the relationship was betrayal of Michael, and that discovery would trigger exactly the kind of violent rage that ultimately ended both their lives. The messages between Anjali and Arjun documented her conflicted feelings about her marriage, her regret about choosing practical security over genuine love, her fear of Michael's temper and controlling behavior, and her fantasy that she might somehow find a way to leave Michael and return to India to be with Arjun, despite the practical impossibility of such a plan, given the immigration complications, her family's likely reaction, and Michael's personality type that suggested he would never simply accept her leaving, but would instead view it as unforgivable betrayal requiring retribution. The wedding ceremony that united Michael and Anjali on June 7, 2023, appeared to guests as beautiful celebration of cross-cultural love, with traditional American and Indian elements combined to honor both backgrounds while creating something unique that reflected their supposedly harmonious blending of different worlds. The reality known only to Anjali was that she had been crying in the bridal suite before the ceremony, composing a final message to Arjun, expressing her love and her devastation that circumstances had forced them apart, then deleting the message and walking down the aisle to marry a man she did not truly love, but who represented security and opportunity and family approval, even as she sacrificed the authentic connection that she would spend the rest of her tragically short life yearning to reclaim, despite the impossibility and danger of attempting to maintain both relationships simultaneously. The discovery of Anjali's affair triggered a psychological crisis in Michael Turner that combined his pathological need for control with his military conditioning toward decisive violent action when confronted with perceived threats, and his deeply internalized beliefs about masculine honor requiring retribution against anyone who dared to betray or humiliate him. The hours Michael spent reading through months of messages between Anjali and Arjun were documented through the timestamps on his own phone searches about infidelity, betrayal, and appropriate responses to wives who cheated, revealing someone whose rage was building methodically rather than exploding immediately, and whose military training had taught him to plan operations carefully before executing them with maximum effectiveness and minimum risk of failure or capture. The confrontation between Michael and Anjali that occurred when he woke her at 2:15 in the morning on June 15th was witnessed by no one but left evidence in the form of damaged furniture, broken glass, and Anjali's frightened calls to her sister Priya in Mumbai, where she whispered that Michael had discovered her relationship with Arjun and that she was terrified about what he might do. Priya's advice was to leave immediately and seek help from police or domestic violence services, but Anjali expressed fear that calling police might jeopardize her immigration status and that leaving might trigger even more violence from Michael, who had explicitly told her that if she tried to escape, he would ensure she regretted it. Through methods he was fully capable of implementing based on skills he had developed during combat operations, where eliminating threats was not merely acceptable but required for mission, success, and unit survival. The monitoring of Anjali's communications that Michael implemented after discovering the affair was comprehensive and sophisticated, with him installing tracking software on her phone, accessing her social media accounts through passwords he demanded she provide, and apparently following her movements through vehicle tracking devices he had placed on her car without her knowledge. The surveillance revealed that Anjali was planning to meet Arjun during his upcoming business trip to Texas, with messages discussing specific times and locations that would allow them to see each other, despite the danger, and despite Anjali's awareness that discovery would likely result in violence, that Michael's military background and personality type made not merely possible but probable, given his explicit threats about consequences for continued betrayal. The decision that Arjun Patel made to fly to Texas, knowing that Anjali was newly married, represented his own desperate hope that seeing her in person might somehow change the situation, or that she might recognize the impossibility of remaining with Michael and choose to return to India, despite all the practical obstacles such a choice would create. The messages between Arjun and Anjali in the days before his trip revealed both their awareness that meeting was dangerous and their inability to resist the opportunity to see each other one final time, with Anjali explicitly warning Arjun that Michael had become suspicious and volatile, but Arjun dismissing the danger based on his conviction that their love was worth any risk, and his apparent underestimation of how violently an armed combat veteran with pathological control issues might react to discovering his wife meeting secretly with her former boyfriend. The surveillance that Michael conducted on June 16th revealed the exact time and location where Anjali planned to meet Arjun, with Michael following her from their home in North Dallas to the hotel near the airport where Arjun had booked a room for their rendezvous. The forensic timeline would later establish that Michael had been parked in the hotel lot for approximately 47 minutes before Anjali arrived, suggesting he had been preparing himself psychologically for the confrontation and violence he apparently had already decided would be his response to this ultimate confirmation of his wife's betrayal and his humiliation at having been deceived by both her and her lover, who had shown complete disrespect for his position as her husband. The confrontation in the hotel parking lot occurred at approximately 7:38 that evening, when Anjali arrived to meet Arjun, who had texted her his room number, but suggested they first talk in his rental car before going inside. The security camera footage captured from multiple angles showed Michael approaching the vehicle where Anjali and Arjun were sitting, his body language showing controlled aggression rather than wild rage as he gestured for them to exit the car. The audio that was not captured by security cameras, but that was reconstructed through witness statements, revealed Michael shouting about betrayal and disrespect before the shooting began, with Arjun apparently attempting to protect Anjali and being shot first before Michael turned the weapon on his wife, who, according to witnesses, was begging for her life and promising to do anything he wanted if he would spare her. The execution-style nature of the killings was documented through forensic analysis, showing that all shots had been fired from close range, with precision suggesting someone who had maintained emotional control despite the rage that motivated the violence, contradicting any potential claim that Michael had acted in heat of passion or temporary insanity, rather than executing a deliberate plan to punish both people who had betrayed him. The fatal shot to Arjun's head after he was already incapacitated from chest wounds demonstrated particular viciousness and determination to ensure death rather than merely wounding, while the single shot that killed Anjali suggested Michael had been coldly efficient rather than losing control, making conscious decisions about each action, rather than simply reacting emotionally to the situation he had discovered. The witnesses who observed the shooting from various locations in the parking lot and hotel windows described Michael's calm demeanor immediately after the killings, with him walking methodically to his truck, placing his weapon in a case, and driving away at normal speed rather than fleeing frantically as might be expected from someone who had just committed double homicide in public location with numerous potential observers. The controlled behavior suggested military training and personality type that could compartmentalize extreme violence and remain functional rather than becoming overwhelmed by emotion or panic, supporting prosecution theories that Michael had planned the murders carefully and had executed them with the same precision and detachment he would have applied to combat operations during his Marine Corps service. The surrender at Dallas Police Headquarters occurred at 8:43, approximately 65 minutes after the shootings, with Michael calmly informing desk officers that he had just killed his wife and her lover, and that he wanted to turn himself in before providing his weapon, and waiting quietly for homicide detectives to arrive and begin their investigation. The confession Michael provided during initial questioning was detailed and unemotional, describing his discovery of Anjali's affair, his surveillance of their planned meeting, and his decision to confront them and execute both as punishment for their betrayal and disrespect, showing no apparent remorse beyond his statement that they had forced him to take action through their own choices, to deceive and humiliate him, despite knowing the kind of man he was and what his likely response would be to such ultimate disrespect. The crime scene processing revealed extensive physical evidence, including shell casings, blood spatter patterns, and ballistic evidence that all confirmed Michael's account of the shootings, while also documenting the precision and deliberateness of his actions that contradicted any claim of heat of passion or temporary loss of control. The positioning of the victims' bodies and the trajectory analysis of the bullets demonstrated that Michael had been standing over them when he fired the fatal shots, executing them rather than shooting during struggle or confrontation that might have suggested some degree of accident or unintended escalation beyond what he had initially planned. The notification of Anjali's family in Mumbai brought devastating news to parents who had believed they were providing their daughter with wonderful opportunity through her marriage to successful American businessman, only to discover that she had been murdered 7 days after her wedding by the man they had entrusted with her safety and happiness. The guilt that Anjali's family experienced was compounded by their awareness that they had pressured her into the marriage despite her apparent reluctance, and despite their knowledge that she had been in love with Arjun, whom they had forbidden her to marry due to their own prejudices and priorities that had ultimately contributed to the circumstances leading to her death. The investigation into Michael Turner's background revealed troubling history, including domestic violence complaint from a previous girlfriend who had not pursued charges due to intimidation and fear, multiple incidents where colleagues and employees reported his explosive temper and threatening behavior, and documented PTSD from combat experiences that had never been properly treated despite obvious symptoms, including hypervigilance, difficulty controlling anger, and tendency toward violence when feeling disrespected or challenged. The pattern suggested someone whose psychological issues had been building toward inevitable violent outbreak rather than representing isolated incident triggered solely by Anjali's betrayal, though Michael's defenders would later claim that the affair was such profound betrayal that even stable individuals might respond with violence. The formal charges filed against Michael Turner included 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances based on the premeditated nature of the killings and the fact that multiple victims had been murdered during a ploughter, single incident, charges that carried potential death penalty under Texas law, though prosecutors would ultimately need to decide whether to pursue capital punishment or accept plea agreement for life imprisonment without parole. The evidence supporting first-degree murder charges included Michael's internet searches about appropriate responses to infidelity, his systematic surveillance of Anjali and Arjun, his following them to the hotel, and the execution-style nature of the shootings that demonstrated planning and deliberation rather than heat of passion that might have supported lesser charges of voluntary manslaughter or second-degree murder. The bail hearing attracted significant media attention, as defense attorneys argued that Michael's military service, his business ties to the community, and his voluntary surrender demonstrated he was not flight risk and should be released pending trial with electronic monitoring and travel restrictions. Prosecutors vigorously opposed bail by presenting evidence of Michael's threats to kill Anjali if she tried to leave him, witness statements about his violent temper, and psychological evaluations suggesting he posed ongoing danger to anyone he perceived as having betrayed or disrespected him, including potentially targeting Anjali's family members who might testify against him during trial proceedings. Judge Robert Martinez ultimately denied bail after reviewing the brutal nature of the killings and determining that no conditions of release could adequately protect public safety from someone who had demonstrated capacity for premeditated execution of two unarmed individuals who had posed no physical threat requiring lethal response. The defense strategy that emerged through pretrial motions focused heavily on Michael's PTSD and combat trauma as mitigating factors that had impaired his judgment and emotional control when confronted with his wife's betrayal, arguing that while his actions were criminal, they should be understood within context of psychological damage from military service that had never been adequately treated despite obvious symptoms. The defense also attempted to introduce evidence about Anjali's affair as provocation that would support reducing charges from first-degree to second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter, though prosecutors objected that infidelity did not constitute adequate provocation under law to justify violence, and that Michael's calculated planning demonstrated premeditation incompatible with heat of passion defenses. The prosecution's case was built around demonstrating that Michael had deliberately planned and executed the murders, rather than acting impulsively in response to discovering the affair, with timeline evidence showing he had at least 48 hours between discovering the messages and committing the killings, during which he could have chosen alternatives, including divorce, separation, or simply confronting Anjali verbally, rather than resorting to lethal violence. The internet searches on Michael's devices during those 48 hours revealed queries about justifiable homicide, crimes of passion, and whether infidelity constituted legal provocation, suggesting he had been researching potential defenses while planning the murders, rather than losing control in moment of discovery. The testimony from Captain Mark Hollis, Michael's former commanding officer in the Marines, provided complex picture of someone who had been exceptional soldier with strong sense of duty and loyalty, but who also displayed rigid black and white, thinking about honor, respect, and appropriate responses to betrayal that made him potentially dangerous in civilian contexts where violence was never acceptable solution to relationship problems. Hollis described incidents where Michael had displayed excessive aggression toward enemy combatants, even by military standards, and how his difficulty transitioning to civilian life had been apparent during his final months of service, when he had been increasingly irritable and confrontational with fellow Marines over minor perceived slights or disrespect. The forensic psychology testimony from Dr. Karen Lewis explained how combat PTSD could create hypervigilance and exaggerated threat responses, but also emphasized that millions of veterans with similar trauma managed to avoid violence against intimate partners, and that Michael's particular combination of narcissistic personality traits, pathological jealousy, and need for absolute control created a especially dangerous profile that his PTSD amplified rather than caused. Dr. Lewis testified that Michael's view of Anjali as possession and status symbol, rather than as autonomous individual deserving respect, made him particularly likely to respond violently to any perceived challenge to his ownership and authority over her, with the affair representing ultimate attack on his masculine identity and public image that his personality structure could not tolerate without violent retaliation. The testimony from Priya Mehta, Anjali's sister, who had traveled from Mumbai to testify despite her grief and her family's reluctance to participate in proceedings, they found emotionally devastating, provided crucial insight into Anjali's state of mind during her marriage to Michael and her conflicted feelings about leaving Arjun to marry someone her family approved of, despite her recognition that she did not truly love Michael in the deep, emotional way she had loved Arjun throughout their 4-year relationship. Priya's testimony included reading portions of Anjali's messages, where she had expressed fear of Michael's temper, confusion about whether she had made a terrible mistake in marrying him, and desperate hope that somehow she might find a way to escape the marriage and return to India, despite all the practical and family obstacles such a plan would face. The presentation of the security camera footage showing the actual shootings was emotionally devastating for everyone in the courtroom, with Michael's calm, deliberate approach to the victim's vehicle, his gestures commanding them to exit, and his methodical execution of first Arjun and then Anjali, all visible in graphic detail that left no doubt about the premeditated nature of his actions and his complete emotional control throughout the killings. The footage contradicted defense claims that Michael had lost control in a moment of rage, instead showing someone executing a plan with military precision and maintaining sufficient presence of mind to ensure both victims were dead before calmly walking away from the scene. The testimony from witnesses who had observed the shooting provided additional detail about Michael's demeanor, with several describing how he had appeared cold and robotic rather than emotionally distraught, how he had checked both victims to confirm they were dead before leaving, and how his departure from the scene had been methodical rather than panicked, despite having just committed double homicide in public location where numerous people had witnessed his actions. The witness accounts reinforced prosecution theory that Michael had planned the murders as punishment for betrayal and had executed them with the same detachment he would have applied to combat operations where eliminating targets was mission objective requiring emotional distance rather than passionate engagement. The trial of Michael Turner began in November 2023 before a jury of 12 Dallas County residents who had been carefully screened for biases about military service, domestic violence, infidelity, and cross-cultural marriages that might prevent them from fairly evaluating evidence about whether Michael's actions constituted premeditated first-degree murder or whether mitigating factors, including his PTSD, Anjali's affair warranted lesser charges or even acquittal based on temporary insanity or extreme emotional disturbance. The opening statements presented competing narratives about whether Michael was a calculating murderer who had executed 2 people for daring to disrespect him, or whether he was a traumatized veteran who had snapped under psychological pressure of discovering his new wife's betrayal in ways that his combat-damaged brain could not process without reverting to violent threat elimination responses he had been trained to employ during military service. Prosecutor Amanda Richardson's opening emphasized the cold, calculated nature of Michael's crimes, the 48 hours he had to choose alternatives to violence, his systematic surveillance of Anjali and Arjun, and the execution-style killings that demonstrated military precision rather than heat of passion or loss of control. Richardson argued that Michael's PTSD did not excuse premeditated murder and that accepting trauma-based defenses too readily would effectively create different standards of justice for veterans versus civilians while dishonoring the vast majority of combat veterans who managed their psychological challenges without murdering people who disappointed or betrayed them in ways that hurt feelings but did not justify lethal violence. Defense attorney Thomas Brennan's opening portrayed Michael as a broken warrior whose psychological damage from combat service had never been adequately treated by military or VA systems that had failed their obligation to provide care. For someone who had sacrificed his mental health, serving his country, Brennan acknowledged that Michael had killed Anjali and Arjun, but argued that his actions should be understood within context of PTSD, betrayal, trauma, and rigid military conditioning about loyalty and appropriate responses to threats, suggesting that jurors should convict on lesser charges, acknowledging his impaired mental state rather than first-degree murder, requiring proof of calm deliberation that someone with Michael's psychological profile could not actually achieve when confronted with situation, his damaged brain interpreted as existential attack, requiring immediate violent response. The medical examiner testimony provided graphic detail about the nature and extent of Anjali's and Arjun's injuries, with Dr. Patricia Chen describing the bullet trajectories, the sequence of shots, and the medical conclusion that both victims had been executed at close range by someone who maintained steady aim and deliberate shot placement despite whatever emotional state might have motivated the violence. The autopsy findings contradicted any claim of accident or unintended escalation, instead documenting systematic killing designed to ensure death rather than merely wound or disable, supporting prosecution theory of premeditated execution rather than impulsive violence during heated confrontation. The testimony from Anjali's family members was emotionally devastating as they described the daughter and sister they had lost, the guilt they felt about pressuring her into marriage with Michael despite her reluctance, and their horror at discovering that their desire to provide her with secure, comfortable life had actually placed her in mortal danger from someone whose charming, confident exterior had concealed violent, controlling personality that had ultimately killed her when she dared to maintain emotional connection with man she had genuinely loved. The family's victim impact testimony emphasized that Anjali had been a vibrant, talented young woman whose potential had been destroyed by someone who viewed her as property rather than person deserving autonomy and respect. The forensic psychology testimony about domestic violence patterns provided framework for understanding Michael's controlling behavior toward Anjali, his escalating jealousy and possessiveness, his threats when she contemplated leaving, and his ultimate violence when she committed what he perceived as ultimate betrayal by maintaining relationship with former boyfriend. Expert witness Dr. Robert Morrison testified that Michael's behavior fit classic pattern of domestic abuser who isolated victim, monitored her activities, threatened retaliation if she left, and ultimately followed through on those threats with lethal violence when victim attempted to exercise autonomy or maintain relationships outside abuser's control. The testimony from Michael's former girlfriend who had filed but not pursued domestic violence complaint provided crucial pattern evidence showing that Anjali was not his first victim of controlling abusive behavior and that his violence was not isolated response to extraordinary betrayal but rather consistent with his established personality and relationship patterns. The former girlfriend described Michael's jealous monitoring of her communications, his explosive rage when she spoke with male friends or colleagues, his threats about consequences if she left him, and the physical violence that had prompted her initial police report before she decided not to pursue charges due to fear of retaliation, and Michael's threats about what he would do to her reputation and career if she continued with prosecution. The defense presentation of Michael's military service record and PTSD documentation attempted to generate sympathy for someone who had sacrificed his mental health serving his country and who had never received adequate treatment. Despite clear need for intensive psychological intervention, the defense called psychiatrists who testified that Michael's combat experiences had fundamentally altered his brain function and threat response patterns, making him hypersensitive to perceived betrayal and prone to violent reactions when feeling disrespected or attacked. Though prosecution cross-examination established that these same experts acknowledged that PTSD did not eliminate capacity for conscious choice, and that Michael's actions demonstrated planning and deliberation inconsistent with claims of impaired judgment or uncontrollable impulse. The testimony from employees at Michael's construction company revealed workplace pattern of intimidation and threatened violence, with several describing incidents where Michael had physically confronted workers who challenged his decisions or made mistakes, creating culture of fear where people were afraid to question his judgment or report his behavior to authorities who might intervene. The workplace testimony supported prosecution theory that Michael's violence toward Anjali and Arjun was consistent with his broader pattern of using threats and aggression to maintain dominance and punish anyone who dared to disrespect or challenge his authority in any context, whether professional or personal. The closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives about responsibility, mental health, betrayal, and whether Michael's actions deserved the most severe punishment available under law, or whether mitigating factors including his PTSD and Anjali's affair warranted more lenient outcome, acknowledging his psychological damage while still holding him accountable for taking 2 lives. Prosecutor Richardson emphasized the planning, the surveillance, the execution-style killings, and Michael's own statements, showing consciousness of guilt and awareness that his actions were wrong, but that he felt justified in committing them as punishment for intolerable disrespect and betrayal. Defense attorney Brennan's closing emphasized Michael's military service, his documented PTSD, The devastating nature of discovering his new wife's affair with her ex-boyfriend, and his supposedly impaired capacity for rational decision-making when his trauma-damaged brain interpreted the situation as existential threat, requiring violent response to protect his psychological survival. The defense argument that Michael deserved sympathy rather than maximum punishment fell flat, with many observers who felt that regardless of his trauma, he had made conscious choice to murder two people who had not threatened him physically, and whose relationship, however hurtful to his feelings, did not justify execution without trial or opportunity for them to defend themselves. The jury deliberation extended over 3 days, as 12 citizens wrestled with questions about mental health, military service, betrayal, premeditation, and whether the evidence supported first-degree murder convictions with potential death penalty exposure, or whether lesser charges might better reflect the complex circumstances, including Michael's PTSD and the emotional impact of discovering his wife's infidelity during what should have been their honeymoon period establishing their new life together. The length of deliberation reflected the jury's careful consideration of whether Michael's military trauma provided sufficient mitigation to reduce his culpability, despite the clear evidence of planning and the brutal execution-style nature of the killings that suggested someone fully in control of his actions, regardless of his emotional state. The verdict announcement on December 8, 2023, brought Michael Turner back into the crowded courtroom, where families from both victims, media representatives, and members of both military veteran and domestic violence advocacy communities waited anxiously to learn whether the jury had found Michael guilty of first-degree murder, warranting potential death sentence, or whether they had accepted defense arguments about PTSD and betrayal trauma, justifying lesser conviction, acknowledging his impaired mental state during the killings. The jury foreman stood and announced guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree murder, indicating the jury had concluded that whatever Michael's psychological issues, the evidence of planning and deliberate execution demonstrated premeditation and malice aforethought required for the most serious murder charges under Texas law. The sentencing phase that followed the verdict included testimony about whether Michael should receive death penalty or life imprisonment without possibility of parole, with prosecutors arguing that the brutal nature of the killings, the multiple victims, and the lack of genuine remorse warranted the ultimate punishment, while defense attorneys pleaded for life sentence based on Michael's military service, his PTSD, and the possibility that with treatment he might eventually understand the terrible wrong he had committed and achieve some measure of redemption that execution would prevent. The victim impact statements from Anjali's and Arjun's families were emotionally devastating as they described the permanent holes left in their lives and their determination that Michael face maximum consequences for destroying two young people whose only crime had been maintaining emotional connection that hurt no one until Michael decided their relationship deserved death penalty he had no legal or moral authority to impose. The jury's sentencing decision reflected careful balancing of aggravating factors, including the premeditated execution-style killings against mitigating factors, including Michael's military service and documented PTSD, ultimately resulting in sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than death penalty, sparing Michael's life while ensuring he would never be released to potentially harm anyone else. The sentence represented compromise between jurors who felt death penalty was warranted and those who believed that Michael's military service and mental health issues deserved consideration, even though they did not excuse his crime or eliminate his responsibility for deliberately taking two innocent lives. Judge Martinez's statement accompanying the sentence condemned Michael's abuse of his military training to execute two unarmed people who had not threatened him physically and whose relationship, however hurtful to his pride, did not justify vigilante violence that civilized society could not tolerate regardless of perpetrator's background or psychological challenges. The judge emphasized that accepting trauma-based defenses too readily would undermine accountability and dishonor veterans who managed their PTSD without murdering people who disappointed or betrayed them, and that Michael's deliberate planning and execution-style killings demonstrated consciousness of guilt incompatible with claims of impaired judgment or uncontrollable impulse requiring sympathy rather than severe punishment. The immediate aftermath of sentencing included Michael's mother's emotional statement to media, expressing her devastation at losing her son to life imprisonment, while acknowledging that he had committed terrible crimes requiring severe consequences, despite her belief that military and VA systems had failed their obligation to provide treatment that might have prevented the tragedy if it had been implemented during his transition to civilian life, when warning signs were apparent to anyone who knew him well. The family statements reflected the multiple layers of tragedy, including not only the deaths of Anjali and Arjun, but also the destruction of Michael's life through his own criminal choices that had been influenced but not caused by his combat trauma. The appeals process that Michael's attorneys initiated focused on whether the trial court had properly instructed the jury about PTSD and its potential impact on premeditation, whether certain evidence about Anjali's affair should have been excluded as prejudicial, and whether the prosecution had been allowed to present excessive victim impact testimony that inflamed jurors' emotions, rather than allowing them to focus rationally on the legal questions they were supposed to decide. The appellate briefs argued that Michael deserved new trial with better jury instructions about mental health issues and with more balanced presentation of evidence that would give jurors better framework for understanding his actions, within context of his psychological damage, rather than simply viewing him as calculating murderer, deserving no sympathy or consideration. The lasting impact of Michael Turner's crimes extended far beyond the 2 lives he had taken and his own life sentence, touching families across 2 continents and raising uncomfortable questions about how military trauma should be factored into criminal justice proceedings, whether society adequately supported veterans transitioning to civilian life, and what responsibility individuals bore for seeking help when they recognized their own psychological deterioration before it escalated to violence that destroyed multiple lives, including their own. The case became reference point in ongoing debates about PTSD defenses, domestic violence in military families, and the particular vulnerabilities of immigrant women who married American men and found themselves isolated in unfamiliar country, where their immigration status and lack of independent support networks made them especially susceptible to control and abuse by partners who exploited their dependence. The grief that consumed Anjali's family was complicated by their recognition that they had contributed to the circumstances leading to her death by pressuring her into marriage with Michael, despite her obvious reluctance and despite their knowledge that she loved Arjun, whom they had forbidden her to marry based on caste prejudices and economic considerations that seemed tragically petty compared to the ultimate cost of their interference in her romantic choices. The guilt that Anjali's parents carried about having essentially delivered their daughter to someone who would murder her 7 days after their wedding was compounded by their awareness that if they had simply accepted her relationship with Arjun, she would likely still be alive and happy in India rather than dead in Texas, having been killed by the man they had believed represented security and opportunity, rather than recognizing the warning signs of his dangerous, controlling personality. The impact on Arjun's family in Ahmedabad was similarly devastating as they processed the loss of their son, who had been killed for the crime of loving someone whose family had deemed him unsuitable based on arbitrary social hierarchies that had driven Anjali into marriage with someone far more dangerous than Arjun could ever have been, despite his supposedly lower caste status. The tragedy highlighted the often deadly consequences of caste discrimination and arranged marriage pressures that forced young people into relationships they did not want, while forbidding unions based on genuine love and compatibility, with Arjun and Anjali paying the ultimate price for families' adherence to traditional prejudices that prioritized social status over their children's actual happiness and safety. The advocacy work that emerged from the case included enhanced screening for domestic violence warning signs in immigration interviews for fiancé visa applicants, improved resources for immigrant women who found themselves trapped in abusive relationships and feared that reporting abuse might jeopardize their legal status, and better coordination between domestic violence services and immigration authorities to ensure that victims could escape dangerous situations without fear of deportation. The reforms represented recognition that immigrant women married to American citizens faced unique vulnerabilities, requiring specialized protective measures beyond those available to native-born women who had stronger support networks and better understanding of available resources. The military community's response to the case divided between those who felt Michael's PTSD deserved more consideration and sympathy versus those who insisted that trauma did not excuse murder and that accepting such defenses too readily would dishonor the vast majority of veterans who managed their psychological challenges without committing violence against innocent people who had not threatened them physically. The debates reflected broader tensions about how society should balance appreciation for military service with accountability for criminal behavior, and whether veterans should be held to same standards as civilians, or whether their service and sacrifice warranted special consideration even when they committed serious crimes. The domestic violence prevention initiatives inspired by Anjali's murder included educational campaigns targeting immigrant communities about recognizing warning signs of dangerous relationships, understanding that isolation and control were forms of abuse requiring intervention before they escalated to physical violence, and knowing how to access help without jeopardizing immigration status that many abusers weaponized against their victims by threatening to report them to authorities if they sought assistance or attempted to leave. The programs emphasized that no woman deserved to be trapped in an abusive relationship, regardless of her immigration status, and that protecting vulnerable individuals required systemic changes, addressing both the abuse itself and immigration policies that abusers exploited to maintain control. The psychological research inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of how military trauma interacted with pre-existing personality disorders to create particularly dangerous combinations requiring intensive intervention and monitoring, and how warning signs of potential violence could be recognized early enough to provide treatment before deterioration reached a point where tragedy became inevitable. The research emphasized that PTSD alone did not typically lead to extreme violence against intimate partners, but that when combined with narcissistic traits, pathological jealousy, and rigid authoritarian worldview, it created psychological profile requiring specialized treatment approaches that standard PTSD interventions might not adequately address. The legislative efforts prompted by the case included proposals for mandatory PTSD screening and treatment for all combat veterans transitioning to civilian life, enhanced gun control measures, preventing individuals with documented violent tendencies from possessing firearms regardless of their military service, and improved coordination between military healthcare systems and civilian mental health services to ensure continuity of care for veterans whose psychological issues made them potential threats to themselves or others. The legislative proposals faced significant political obstacles from groups opposing gun restrictions and from those who felt that stigmatizing veterans as potential dangers would discourage military service and insult those who had sacrificed for their country. The impact on cross-cultural marriage attitudes included increased caution among Indian families about allowing daughters to marry foreign nationals and move abroad where they would be isolated from family support systems, though advocates emphasized that the problem was not international marriage per se, but rather the need for better screening for domestic violence warning signs and better support systems for immigrant women regardless of whom they married or where they lived. The case prompted discussions about how cultural differences could complicate domestic violence intervention and how service providers needed cultural competency to effectively assist immigrant victims who might face language barriers, unfamiliarity with American systems, and fear of authorities based on negative experiences in their countries of origin. The memorial established in Anjali's and Arjun's names supported young Indian artists and provided scholarships for women pursuing independence through education and career development, representing an attempt to create positive legacy from tragic deaths, while also honoring the dreams and potential that had been destroyed by violence rooted in jealousy, control, and rigid beliefs about honor, requiring retribution against anyone who dared to challenge or disrespect someone who viewed himself as deserving absolute loyalty and obedience. The memorial emphasized that true honor came from respecting others' autonomy and humanity, rather than from dominating and ultimately destroying anyone who exercised independence or maintained relationships outside one's control. The ongoing impact of Michael Turner's crimes continued reverberating through the lives of everyone touched by the tragedy. From the families who would never recover from their losses to the communities forced to confront uncomfortable truths about military trauma, domestic violence, and the deadly intersection of control, jealousy, and access to weapons combined with training in their lethal use. The case served as permanent reminder that behind statistics about domestic violence and murder-suicide were real people whose lives had been destroyed by someone's inability to accept that love required respecting partners' autonomy rather than viewing them as property, to be controlled and eliminated when they dared to maintain emotional connections outside the relationship. The transformation of Michael Turner, from decorated, Marine and successful businessman to convicted double murderer serving life sentence, represented the tragic waste of potential and the cascading consequences when psychological issues went untreated and when cultural messages about masculine honor and appropriate responses to betrayal combined with military training and access to weapons to create deadly combination that destroyed multiple lives in moment of rage and wounded pride that Michael would spend the rest of his life imprisoned. For while the victims' families spent the rest of their lives grieving losses that might have been prevented if warning signs had been recognized and acted upon before Michael's controlling behavior escalated, to the ultimate control of deciding who lived and who died, based on his assessment of who deserved punishment for daring to disrespect him. The enduring message from this tragedy emphasizes that domestic violence is never justified regardless of provocation, that military trauma requires professional treatment rather than being ignored until it explodes into violence, that immigrant women deserve enhanced protections and support services addressing their unique vulnerabilities, that families should prioritize their children's actual happiness and safety over social status and traditional prejudices, and that society must fundamentally reject cultural narratives suggesting that betrayal or infidelity justifies violence beyond what would be acceptable as lawful response, including divorce, separation, and legal accountability, rather than vigilante execution of people who hurt feelings but did not threaten lives. The story of Michael, Anjali, and Arjun stands as permanent testimony to the devastating consequences when possessive jealousy, untreated trauma, and access to lethal weapons combine with rigid beliefs about honor and retribution to transform what began as romantic dreams into nightmare of violence, loss, and permanent devastation across multiple families and communities that will carry the scars of these murders for generations.